Richard Sterling thought he had calculated every variable. He was the man who had everything: the tech empire, the trophy wife, and the millions in the bank. But he lacked one thing: closure. Driven by a petty need to destroy the past, he mailed a wedding invitation to his destitute ex-wife, Sarah, expecting her to show up in rags so he could laugh in her face. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to break her one last time. But when a 60-foot custom Rolls-Royce rolled onto the lawn of his estate, Richard realized too late that the woman stepping out wasn't the victim he remembered. She was the owner of the very ground he was standing on. This is the story of the ultimate wedding day revenge. Richard Sterling stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of his 42nd floor office in downtown Seattle, watching the rain streak against the pane like tears he was incapable of shedding. At 38, Richard was the embodiment of new money aggression. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars, and on his wrist sat a Patek Philippe watch that he checked obsessively, not because he was late, but because he liked reminding himself that his time was the most expensive commodity in the room. On the mahogany desk behind him lay a single envelope made of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. It was embossed with gold leaf, smelling faintly of lavender and arrogance. "Are you sure about this, Rick?" The voice came from the leather armchair in the corner. Carter Bennett, Richard's longtime attorney and reluctant conscience, was swirling a glass of scotch. Carter was a man of jagged features and tired eyes, the kind of lawyer who knew where the bodies were buried because he had usually dug the holes. Richard didn't turn around. He kept his gaze fixed on the grey city below. "Am I sure about inviting the mother of my mistakes to my wedding? Absolutely. It's the final nail in the coffin, Carter. The symbolic end to the struggle years." "It's petty," Carter said, taking a sip. "You're marrying Tiffany. She's 24, a model, and thinks the Cayman Islands are a brand of fruit juice. You've won. Why drag Sarah into this? The woman is likely working double shifts at a diner just to pay rent on a studio apartment." "Leave her alone?" Richard turned then, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. It was a handsome face, but his eyes were cold, devoid of warmth. "That is exactly why I'm inviting her. Do you remember the day I left her? She screamed that I would be nothing without her support. She claimed she was the backbone of my success." He walked over to the desk and picked up the envelope, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. "I want her to see this. I want her to see Tiffany. I want her to see the Sterling estate. I want to look her in the eye while I say I do, and watch the realization break her that she was nothing but a stepping stone." Carter sighed, setting his glass down. "You're playing with fire, Rick. Sarah wasn't just some housewife. She was smart. She handled the books in the early days. She knows things." "She knows nothing," Richard snapped, his voice rising. "She knows how to clip coupons. She knows how to beg. I stripped her of everything in the divorce, Carter. You made sure of that. The prenup was ironclad. She got the old Honda and her maiden name back. That's it. She is a ghost." Richard tossed the envelope onto the outgoing mail pile. It landed with a soft thud that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet office. The invitation was addressed to Ms. Sarah Miller, sent to a P.O. box in a rundown district of Portland, Oregon. Richard had hired a private investigator 3 months ago just to find her address. The report had been pathetic. Sarah was listed as unemployed, living in a sublet apartment above a laundromat, with no significant assets. The report stated she had dropped off the grid for 2 years following the divorce. Perfect. "She won't come," Carter muttered. "She will," Richard corrected, checking his reflection in the dark window. "She still loves me. Or she hates me." It doesn't matter. Curiosity is a disease, and Sarah was always terminally curious. She'll come hoping for a handout, or an apology, or just to see if I'm truly happy. And when she arrives, in her department store dress and worn-out shoes, I'm going to have security seat her in the back row, right next to the kitchen entrance. Richard sat down and opened his laptop, pulling up the spreadsheet for the wedding expenses. The event was costing $4 million. The flowers alone were imported from Holland. The venue was the Sterling Estate, a sprawling historic mansion on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, a property Richard had technically acquired through a complex lease-to-own agreement with a shadowy holding company to save on taxes, but he treated it as his own. "Tiffany is worried, you know," Carter added, standing up to leave. "She thinks you're obsessed with your ex." "Tiffany is paid to look pretty, not to think," Richard dismissed. "This isn't obsession, Carter. It's victory. Send the invite." As the door clicked shut, Richard leaned back, interlacing his fingers behind his head. He closed his eyes and visualized the moment. He could see it clearly. Sarah, looking aged and tired, standing in the shadow of the massive floral archway, while he, the king of Seattle Tech, kissed his young, vibrant bride. It would be the ultimate validation that he was the superior partner, the one who deserved the world. He didn't know it yet, but that envelope was not a weapon. It was a key, and he had just handed it to the jailer. 300 miles south, in a rain-soaked district of Portland, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of Richard's high-rise. The neighborhood of Greystone was industrial, smelling of wet concrete and diesel fumes. Sarah Miller walked into the small, cramped post office, shaking her umbrella. At 36, Sarah did not look like the broken woman Richard imagined. She wore a simple beige trench coat and dark sunglasses, her hair tied back in a severe, practical bun. She didn't look rich, certainly, but she possessed a kinetic energy, a sharpness in her movement that suggested a woman on a mission. "Morning, Sarah," the postal clerk, a kindly older man named Mr. Henderson, chirped. "Just the one letter today. Looks fancy." Sarah took the cream-colored envelope. Her fingers brushed the gold leaf embossing. She didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The font was Garamond, Richard's favorite. He always said it looked presidential. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice low and melodic. She walked out to the street and sat on a damp bench under the awning of a closed bakery. With surgical precision, she tore the envelope open. "Mr. Richard Sterling and Miss Tiffany Banks request the honor of your presence." A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. It was a sound that frightened the pigeons pecking at crumbs near her boots. "He actually did it," she whispered to the rain. "The arrogance." Sarah closed her eyes, and the memory hit her like a physical blow. 5 years ago. The hospital room. Flashback. The air in the oncology ward had been stifling. Sarah's mother lay in the bed, frail and fading. Sarah had been sitting in the plastic chair for 3 days straight, wearing sweatpants, her eyes red-rimmed. Richard had walked in, not with flowers but with papers. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he had said, looking at his phone rather than her dying mother. "Can't do what?" "Visit?" Sarah had asked, confused. "Us. The marriage. The drag." He waved his hand around the room. "You're always here. You're depressed. I have a company to run. I need a partner who enhances my image, not one who smells like hospital disinfectant. Richard, my mother is dying. I helped you build Sterling Tech from the garage. I wrote the code for the logistics algorithm that got you your first funding. You helped," he scoffed. "But I'm the face, and right now, your face is tired. I've spoken to legal. Since the company was incorporated before the marriage technically started, and the IP is in my name, well, Carter has the details. You get the house in the suburbs. Oh, wait, the bank has a lien on that. Sorry. He had dropped the divorce papers on the bedside table next to her mother's morphine drip. Sign them, Sarah. Don't make it messy. If you fight me, I'll bury you in legal fees until you're living in a cardboard box. He walked out. Her mother died 2 hours later. Sarah signed the papers the next morning, too grief-stricken to fight. She took her old Honda, 3 boxes of clothes, and disappeared. End flashback. Sarah opened her eyes. The rain was coming down harder now. She looked at the invitation again. The date was 3 weeks away. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone. It wasn't the cracked iPhone Richard assumed she would have. It was a prototype satellite phone, encrypted, heavy, and worth more than Richard's car. She dialed a single number. "Yes, Mom?" A deep, gravelly voice answered on the first ring. "Arthur," Sarah said, her voice shifting. Gone was the soft-spoken woman who chatted with the postal clerk. This was a voice of command, cold steel wrapped in velvet. "I've received the invitation." On the other end of the line was Arthur Pendenby, a man known in global financial circles as the Grim Reaper of Wall Street. He was technically retired, but in reality, he served only one client. "I assume he sent it to the drop box in Portland?" Arthur asked. "He did. He thinks I'm destitute, Arthur. He thinks I'm the same woman he left in that hospital room." "Mr. Sterling has always been better at marketing than due diligence," Arthur noted dryly. "Shall I prepare the regret letter?" Sarah stood up, crumpling the envelope but keeping the heavy cardstock invitation. She walked toward the corner where a black sedan with tinted windows was idling, waiting for her. The driver stepped out immediately to open the door. "No, Arthur," Sarah said, sliding into the leather interior of the car. "Accept the invitation." "And Arthur?" "Yes, Mom?" "Initiate Project Icarus. I want a full audit of the Sterling Estate's ownership papers. I want to know who holds his debt, who supplies his catering, and who insures his company. Buy it all." "The wedding is in 3 weeks, Mom." "That is a lot of acquisition." "You have an unlimited budget, Arthur." "Richard wants a show? I'm going to give him a production." Sarah hung up. She looked out the window as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the run-down neighborhood behind. They drove toward the private airfield, where her Gulfstream G650 was waiting. Richard Sterling thought he had invited Sarah Miller, the unemployed divorcee. He didn't know he had actually invited Sarah Sterling, the silent majority shareholder of Orion Holdings, the conglomerate that had secretly been buying up Richard's debt for the last 2 years. She hadn't just been surviving. She had been hunting. And the trap was finally set. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of extravagance for Richard and a period of silent, tactical maneuvering for Sarah. Richard was in his element. He gave an interview to GQ magazine, titling the piece, "The Bachelor King Finally Bows." He showed off the ring, a 10-carat diamond that looked heavy enough to break Tiffany's finger. He hosted stag parties in Vegas and bragged to anyone who would listen about the guest list. "The mayor is coming," Richard told his golf buddies at the country club. "And the senator, it's going to be the event of the decade." "Did you hear back from the ex?" One of his friends, a hedge fund manager named Bradley, asked with a sneer. Richard chuckled, teeing up his ball. "She RSVP'd. By mail, handwritten. Probably couldn't afford the postage for a quicker response. She's coming alone." "That's brutal, Rick," Bradley laughed. "You're going to let her in?" "I'm going to give her a front-row seat to what she missed out on." Richard swung his club. The ball soared, slicing through the air. 4. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled boardroom in Zurich, Switzerland, Sarah sat at the head of a long table. She wasn't wearing the beige trench coat anymore. She was dressed in a sharp, charcoal Armani suit. Arthur Pendenby stood by the screen, displaying a complex web of financial structures. "The acquisition of the debt is complete," Arthur announced to the room of lawyers and accountants. "Sterling Tech is currently leveraged to the hilt. To pay for this wedding and his new lifestyle, Richard borrowed against his company shares. The bank that holds those loans is us," Sarah finished, tapping her pen on the table. "Correct. Orion Holdings now owns the note. Technically, if he misses a single payment, which he is projected to do next month due to the wedding costs, we can call in the loan and seize the assets." "And the venue?" Sarah asked. "The Sterling estate?" Arthur smiled, a rare expression for him. "As you suspected, Richard doesn't own it. He leases it from a shell company in Panama to avoid U.S. property taxes. We bought the shell company yesterday morning. You are effectively his landlord." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Swiss Alps. "He is getting married in my house, using money he borrowed from me to a woman he thinks is an upgrade." "It is poetic," Arthur agreed. "Now about your attire. The team in Milan has sent sketches." Sarah turned back. "No sketches. I know exactly what I'm wearing. Do you remember the red dress he told me was too much for the company Christmas party 5 years ago? The one he made me return because he said I looked like I was trying too hard?" "I recall the incident," Arthur said softly. "He told you to wear grey so you wouldn't outshine him. Get me the designer on the phone." Sarah's eyes glittered with a dangerous light. "I want that dress, but I want it reimagined. I want it to look like blood and fire, and I want diamonds, not the small ones. I want the necklace from the vault." "The Romanov necklace?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "That is aggressive." "It's a declaration of war, Arthur. Ensure the limousine is ready. I want the Phantom, the extended wheelbase, and hire a detail of security, but tell them to stay out of sight. I want to walk in alone." "As you wish, Ms. Sterling." Back in Seattle, the day before the wedding, the weather turned. The sky, usually a slate grey, cleared into a brilliant, mocking blue. Richard stood in the ballroom of the estate, yelling at the florist. "I said white hydrangeas, not off-white. Do I look like I want cream? I want pure white." Tiffany Banks, the bride-to-be, sat on a chair nearby, scrolling through Instagram. She was beautiful, undeniable, but there was a vacuousness to her expression. "Rick, baby, calm down. It looks fine." "It doesn't look fine, Tiff. The magazine photographers will be here at noon tomorrow. Everything has to be perfect. Zara is going to be here. I need her to see perfection." Tiffany looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you care so much if she sees it? You talk about her more than you talk about me." Richard froze. He turned to Tiffany, putting on his charming mask. "Don't be silly. I just want to show her that I won. That we won. It's for us, baby." Tiffany didn't look convinced, but she shrugged and went back to her phone. "Whatever. Just make sure the champagne is chilled. My friends are thirsty." Richard walked out onto the terrace. The ocean crashed against the rocks below. He felt a sudden, strange shiver crawl up his spine. For a second, he felt small. He shook it off. He was Richard Sterling. He was untouchable. He checked his watch, 24 hours to showtime. Little did he know the stage manager had changed, and the script had been rewritten. The wedding day dawned with a sky so aggressively blue it felt saturated, almost artificial. The Sterling estate was transformed into a fortress of white roses, crystal chandeliers hanging from ancient oak trees, and silk ribbons dancing in the gentle ocean breeze. It was a scene ripped straight from the pages of a bridal magazine, exactly as Richard had demanded. By 2 p.m., the guests began to arrive. It was a parade of Seattle's elite. Tech CEOs in $5,000 suits, socialites angling for Instagram angles, Senator Jenkins puffing on a cigar near the cliff edge, and a smattering of B-list celebrities Richard had paid to attend to boost the event's profile. Richard stood at the makeshift altar, beneath a towering floral archway, sweat already prickling beneath his starched collar, despite the cool ocean air. He wasn't nervous about saying, "I do." He considered marriage a contract, easily broken with the right lawyers. He was nervous about his audience, specifically, an audience of one. He kept scanning the back rows, past the silk-covered chairs, toward the service entrance where he had instructed security to direct Sarah. He expected to see a slumped figure in an off-the-rack polyester dress trying to shrink into the background. He wanted to catch her eye and give her a pitying nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far she had fallen and how high he had climbed. But the back row remained empty of any pathetic figures. "Where is she?" Richard hissed to Carter, who was standing nearby as his best man, looking deeply uncomfortable in his tuxedo. "Maybe she got smart and stayed home, Rick," Carter murmured, adjusting his cufflinks. "Let it go. Focus on your bride." "She's coming," Richard insisted, his jaw tight. She wouldn't miss the chance for a free meal. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon. The conversations died down. The guests turned their attention toward the mansion's terrace doors, waiting for Tiffany to emerge. Tiffany Banks stood just inside the glass doors, flanked by 5 bridesmaids wearing dresses identical to the color of Pepto-Bismol. She checked her makeup one last time in her compact mirror. She felt a strange knot of anxiety in her stomach. All morning, Richard hadn't complimented her once. He had just kept asking if the guest list was complete. It was starting to feel less like her special day and more like a corporate merger presentation. The music swelled, the doors opened. Tiffany stepped out, forcing a dazzling smile. But no one was looking at her. A low, guttural rumble began over the delicate sounds of the violins. It grew louder, a deep bass drone that vibrated in the chests of the guests, the sound of a high-performance engine approaching fast. Richard frowned, looking toward the long, winding driveway that led up to the estate. "What is that? A delivery truck?" "Now?" The noise became a roar. The string quartet faltered, then stopped entirely as a vehicle crested the hill. It was not a delivery truck. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, but not a standard model. It was extended, painted a black so deep it seemed to absorb the sunlight, with chrome accents that gleamed like drawn swords. It moved with the menacing grace of a panther. Instead of stopping at the designated valet drop-off point near the garages, the massive vehicle swerved. It drove straight onto the meticulously manicured great lawn, its heavy tires crushing the perfect grass Richard had spent thousands maintaining. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Senator Jenkins dropped his cigar. The car rolled right up to the aisle, stopping just 10 feet from where Richard stood at the altar. The engine cut, leaving a ringing silence that was heavier than the noise had been. "Who does this guy think he is?" Richard snarled, stepping down from the altar, his face turning a violent shade of red. "This is private property. Security!" Before the confused security guards could react, the rear suicide door of the Phantom swung open smoothly. A uniformed chauffeur stood by the door, offering a hand to the passenger. The first thing that emerged was a shoe. It was a Christian Louboutin stiletto, black silk with a heel so sharp it looked like a weapon, complete with the signature red sole. Then Sarah stepped out. The collective intake of breath from 200 guests was audible. She was not wearing an off-the-rack polyester dress. She was wearing redemption wrapped in vengeance. The dress was a custom-made Versace, a deep, shimmering crimson silk that clung to her body like a second skin before cascading to the ground in a dramatic train. It was cut low in the back, daring and powerful. It was the exact shade of red Richard had once forbidden her to wear, reinvented as armor. Her hair, which Richard remembered as being constantly tied back in messy buns during long nights of coding, was styled in glamorous, cascading waves around her shoulders. Her makeup was flawless, accentuating eyes that were no longer tired, but predatory. But it was the necklace that made the socialites in the crowd clutch their own pearls in inadequacy. Around Sarah's neck rested the Romanov constellation, a cascading river of flawless diamonds and rare Burmese rubies that caught the sunlight and fractured it into a blinding rainbow. It was a piece of jewelry rumored to belong to a European vault, something that only came out for royal coronations. Sarah didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the stunned bride, frozen at the top of the aisle. She looked directly at Richard. She didn't smile. Her expression was one of supreme, indifferent boredom, as if she had just stepped out to buy milk rather than crashing the wedding of the decade. Richard felt his knees buckle slightly. The image he had built in his head for 5 years, the grey, defeated mouse, vaporized instantly. The woman standing on his lawn was a lioness. She adjusted her sunglasses, a pair of oversized Chanels, and took a step forward. The sound of her heel hitting the paving stone of the aisle echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the distant crash of the waves below the cliffs and the frantic clicking of the hired wedding photographer's camera. He had abandoned capturing the bride's entrance and was now rapidly snapping photos of the woman in red. Tiffany Banks, still standing at the terrace doors, felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't the smartest woman in the room, but she knew when she had been eclipsed. She looked down at her own Vera Wang gown, which suddenly felt frumpy and excessive compared to the sleek, lethal elegance of the woman on the lawn. "Richard," Tiffany called out, her voice trembling. "Richard, who is that?" Richard didn't answer her. He couldn't take his eyes off Sarah. His brain was misfiring, trying to reconcile the data. How? The Honda, the tiny apartment, the hospital bills. Sarah ignored the bride entirely. She began to walk. She didn't skulk toward the back rows. She walked straight down the center aisle, her crimson train trailing over the white rose petals scattered for Tiffany. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their heads turning in unison as she passed. Whispers erupted like brush fire. "Is that Sarah Miller?" "No way, she looks expensive. That necklace, is that real? It has to be fake. My God, look at Richard's face." Sarah stopped 10 feet from Richard, just short of the altar steps. She took off her sunglasses slowly, revealing eyes that were clear, cold, and utterly unimpressed. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was smooth, low, and carried effortlessly in the quiet air. "You sent an invitation." I accepted, though I must say, the parking situation is dreadful. Richard found his voice, though it sounded strangled. "What is this, Sarah? A costume? Did you rent a car to come here and embarrass yourself?" He tried to laugh, looking around at the guests for support, but nobody joined in. They were too captivated by the spectacle. "You're disrupting my wedding," Richard hissed, taking a step toward her, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate her, as he used to. "You need to leave, now, before I have you thrown out." Sarah tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster who sees mate in 3 moves. "Thrown out?" she repeated, amused. "That's an interesting choice of words, Richard, considering where we are." "We are at my estate," the Sterling estate, and you are trespassing on my lawn." Sarah laughed then. It was a genuine laugh, rich and throaty, and it chilled Richard to the bone. "Oh, Richard, you always did have trouble reading the fine print, didn't you? Just like those divorce papers you rushed me to sign." She snapped her fingers without looking back. From the side crowd near the bandstand, a man stepped forward. It was Arthur Pendenby. He was impeccably dressed in a three-piece charcoal suit, holding a slim leather portfolio. Richard recognized him instantly. You didn't work in high finance without knowing who the Grim Reaper was. "Mr. Pendenby?" Richard stammered, totally confused. "What are you doing here? Are you a guest?" Arthur adjusted his glasses and walked to Sarah's side, opening the portfolio. "I am here in my capacity as legal counsel for Orion Holdings, Mr. Sterling." "Orion Holdings?" Richard frowned. "The international conglomerate? What do they have to do with my wedding?" Sarah held out a hand, and Arthur placed a document into it. "Richard, you don't own this estate," Sarah said calmly, holding up the document. "You lease it. You lease it from a Panamanian shell company called Coastal Ventures LLC to avoid paying U.S. property taxes. Very clever accountant you have." She glanced at Carter, who was now looking at his shoes. "So what?" Richard snapped, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's a standard business practice. I'm the lessee. I have full rights to the property." "You did lease it from Coastal Ventures," Sarah corrected, "until yesterday morning." She dropped the document on the small table meant for the wedding registry book. It landed face up. It was a deed transfer. "Yesterday morning, Orion Holdings acquired 100% equity in Coastal Ventures LLC, Sarah said, her voice ringing out clearly, "which means Orion Holdings now owns the deed to this land and everything sitting on it." She took a step closer to Richard, her eyes boring into his. "And Richard? I am Orion Holdings. I own 90% of the voting stock. I built it from the ground up in the last 5 years, using the IP you thought wasn't worth stealing." The silence that fell over the cliffside was absolute. Even the ocean seemed to quiet down. Richard stared at the document, the letters swimming before his eyes. Sarah owned the house. "So, you see, Richard," Sarah said, gesturing widely to the stunning vista, the mansion, and the guests sitting on her chairs. "You aren't throwing me out, because actually you're getting married in my backyard, and I don't recall approving the permit for that tacky gazebo." From the top of the aisle, a wail broke the silence. Tiffany Banks threw her bouquet on the ground and stomped her foot. "Richard, do something! She's ruining everything!" Tiffany shrieked, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into a temper tantrum. Sarah glanced up at Tiffany, then back to Richard, a look of pure pity on her face. "She's pretty, Richard," Sarah said softly, so only he could hear. "But she doesn't know how to read a balance sheet, does she? You always did prefer depreciation over assets." Richard felt like the cliff edge was crumbling beneath his feet. He had wanted a spectacle. He had gotten a public execution. But Sarah wasn't finished. The house was just the appetizer. She signaled to Arthur again, who pulled a second thicker document from his portfolio. "Now," Sarah said, her voice hardening into steel, "let's talk about how you paid for all of this." Richard Sterling stood on the edge of the precipice, the roar of the ocean below suddenly sounding like applause for his impending destruction. The document on the table, the deed to the estate, felt like a lead weight pressing down on the entire event. But Sarah wasn't finished. She tapped the second leather folder held by Arthur Pendenby. "You asked why I'm here, Richard," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the confused crowd. "I'm here to collect." Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Collect what? Alimony?" "You signed that away," You got nothing. I'm not here for alimony, Sarah corrected, her tone icy. I'm here for the principal, plus interest. She took the second document from Arthur and held it up. It was a thick stack of papers, bound with a heavy red legal clip. Sterling Technologies, Sarah began, addressing the guests as much as Richard. A magnificent company, or so the press releases say. But building a tech empire requires capital, doesn't it? Massive amounts of liquid capital. She turned to Richard. To fund your lifestyle, this wedding, the yacht in the harbour, and the expansion into the Asian markets that failed so miserably last quarter, you didn't use your own money. You leveraged the company. You took out a Series B floating rate loan against your majority shareholding. Richard's face went pale. That's private corporate financial information. How do you know that? I know it, Sarah said, stepping closer, the diamonds at her throat flashing blindingly. Because the bank you borrowed from, Meridian Capital, was looking to offload its risky assets. And since I had some liquidity from my own ventures, I decided to help them out. She dropped the second document onto the table next to the deed. I bought the note, Richard. Orion Holdings is now the primary creditor for Sterling Technologies. I own your debt, all $52 million of it. A gasp went through the crowd. Senator Jenkins, who had been considering investing in Richard's next round, suddenly looked very interested in his shoes. So what? Richard stammered, his bravado crumbling into panic. I make the payments. I've never missed a payment. You can't touch me as long as I pay. Arthur Pendenby cleared his throat. It was a dry, dusty sound. Actually, Mr. Sterling, that is legally inaccurate. Arthur adjusted his spectacles and pointed to a paragraph on page 42 of the contract. Clause 4B, Section 7, the material change in lifestyle clause, Arthur cited from memory. It states that if the debtor engages in excessive personal spending that jeopardizes the solvency of the collateral, that being the company stock, the creditor has the right to demand immediate repayment of the full principal sum. Sarah gestured around the extravagant wedding setup. $4 million on flowers and imported champagne, Richard? While your stock price dipped 12% last week? I'd call that excessive, wouldn't you? Richard looked at Carter. Carter, do something. Tell them they can't do this. Carter Bennett, the lawyer who had ruthlessly negotiated Sarah's exit 5 years ago, looked at the documents. He looked at Arthur Pendenby, a man he knew by reputation to be undefeated in court. Then he looked at his client. They have you, Rick, Carter whispered, closing his eyes. The clause is standard in high-risk loans. If you spend too much, they can call the loan. It's a margin call on your life. I call the loan, Sarah said, her voice ringing out like a judge's gavel. You have 24 hours to wire $52 million to Orion Holdings. If you cannot, I will exercise my right to seize the collateral. The collateral? Tiffany squeaked, finally speaking up. What's the collateral? Sarah looked at the young bride with a mixture of pity and amusement. His shares, Tiffany, all of them. If he doesn't pay by tomorrow, I become the majority owner of Sterling Technologies. I will own his office, his patents, his brand, and his salary. Richard felt the world tilting. You can't do this. You're bluffing. You're just a bitter ex-wife. Bitter? Sarah laughed softly. No, Richard. Bitter is holding a grudge. This is business. You taught me that. It's nothing personal, Sarah, you said when you served me divorce papers while my mother was dying. It's just about efficiency. Well, Richard, I'm being efficient. You are a bad investment. I'm liquidating you. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. You wanted to show me what I missed out on? You succeeded. I missed out on bankruptcy, fraud, and a shallow, empty life. Thank you for that." Richard lunged at her. It was an instinctual, animalistic reaction to being cornered. "You witch! I built that company." Before he could get within 3 feet of her, 2 of the guests sitting in the front row, large men in ill-fitting suits who had remained silent until now, stood up. They intercepted Richard effortlessly, restraining his arms behind his back. "Careful, Mr. Sterling," Arthur warned. "Assaulting the chairman of the board is a felony, and it would violate your parole before you're even arrested." "Let me go," Richard screamed, struggling against the guards. "This is my wedding. You can't ruin my wedding." Sarah adjusted her shawl, looking immaculate and untouched. "The wedding? Oh, I haven't ruined the wedding, Richard. I'm just the landlord collecting rent. But I think the bride might have something to say about the future." Sarah turned her gaze to Tiffany. The silence that descended upon the Sterling estate was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, indifferent crashing of the Pacific Ocean against the cliffs below, a stark reminder of nature's permanence against the fragile ego of one man. All eyes, hundreds of them, pivoted in a single, synchronized wave toward Tiffany Banks. The model stood frozen at the altar, a statue of bridal perfection that was rapidly developing hairline cracks. Her bouquet of imported white orchids, worth more than most people's monthly rent, drooped in her trembling hand. She stared at Richard, but the adoration that had been plastered across her face for the Vogue photographers just an hour ago had evaporated. In its place was a look of dawning, horrifying clarity. Tiffany was not a cruel woman by nature, but she was a survivor. She had curated her life based on security and status. She looked at Richard, sweating and frantic in his bespoke suit. Then her gaze drifted to Sarah, the woman in the blood-red Versace, standing tall, composed, and radiating the kind of power that didn't just come from money, but from ownership. "Tiffany," Richard's voice cracked, a desperate rasp that echoed painfully in the quiet garden. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "Baby, don't listen to her. This is just a maneuver, a hostile takeover attempt. We can fight this. I'm still Richard Sterling. We are still us." Tiffany looked down at the 10-carat diamond on her finger. For months, it had felt heavy with promise. Now, it just felt heavy. It was a shackle, a piece of glass bought with borrowed money that this other woman, this terrifying, magnificent woman, now effectively owned. $52 million? Tiffany whispered. Her voice was small, but in the pin-drop silence, it carried like a scream. "You owe her $52 million? It's leverage, it's corporate debt," Richard yelled, his eyes darting around the crowd, pleading for someone, anyone, to back him up. "Everyone has debt, Tiff. It's how business works. Bezos has debt. Musk has debt." "But they have the assets to cover it," Sarah's voice cut in, smooth and lethal. She hadn't moved, but her presence filled the space between the couple. "Richard doesn't. If I call the loan tomorrow, which I will, his personal guarantee kicks in. He will lose the penthouse, the cars, the accounts, and yes, even the ring on your finger, Tiffany. It's listed as a company expense under marketing materials." Tiffany flinched as if she had been slapped. "Marketing materials?" she repeated, her eyes welling up, not with sadness but with humiliation. "Tiffany, please." Richard dropped to his knees, a pathetic gesture meant to look romantic, but looking only desperate. "We love each other. That's what matters. We can rebuild." Tiffany looked at the man kneeling before her. She didn't see a king anymore. She saw a fraud. She saw a man who had built a castle on quicksand and invited her to stand on the roof just as it collapsed. "I loved the life you promised me, Richard," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "You told me you were a titan. You told me the world was yours. But you're just a squatter." She reached up, her manicured fingers shaking, and ripped the delicate lace veil from her hair. She threw it onto the ground, where it landed in the dirt next to Richard's polished shoes. "I can't do this," she choked out. "I can't be poor, Richard. I won't be." "Tiffany, no!" Richard lunged forward, grabbing the hem of her dress. "Let go of me," she shrieked, kicking her dress free. The veneer of the blushing bride was gone, replaced by a terrified woman fleeing a burning building. "Girls, we're leaving, now!" The 5 bridesmaids, dressed in their Pepto-Bismol pink gowns, looked at each other in panic. Then, like a flock of startled flamingos, they scrambled to follow her. The sound of heels clicking furiously against the stone path echoed like gunfire. "But the reception," one bridesmaid stammered as she ran past the stunned priest. "The catering. There is no reception," Tiffany screamed back over her shoulder, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. "He can't even afford the cake. Run!" They vanished around the corner of the mansion, leaving a trail of dropped petals and shattered dreams. Richard remained on his knees, staring at the spot where his bride had stood. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving. The exodus began slowly, then all at once. Senator Jenkins was the first to move. He checked his watch, feigning a sudden realization. "Security briefing," he muttered to no one in particular, signaling his detail. He practically sprinted toward the parking lot, desperate to distance his re-election campaign from the stench of a bankrupt fraud. The tech bros, the venture capitalists, the socialites, they all followed suit. No one looked at Richard. To look at him was to acknowledge him. And in their world, Richard Sterling had ceased to exist the moment the words, "52 million in debt," were spoken. Chairs scraped against the stone. Purses were snatched up. The murmur of 200 people trying to leave as quickly and quietly as possible sounded like the buzzing of angry hornets. Within 10 minutes, the great lawn was desolate. The white silk ribbons fluttered ghost-like in the breeze. The empty chairs stood in judgmental rows. The only people left were Richard, still kneeling in the dirt. Sarah, standing like a monolith of justice. Arthur Pendenby, clutching his leather portfolio, and the 2 security guards who had stepped back but remained alert. "Release him," Sarah said softly. The guard stepped back, giving Richard space. He didn't stand up. He slumped forward, his hands digging into the white rose petals that were meant for his triumph, now crushed and bruising under his weight. He looked up at Sarah. His face was a mask of ruin, red-rimmed eyes, snot running from his nose, sweat matting his hair. "Why?" he croaked. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching confusion. "Why go to these lengths, Sarah? You won. You obviously have money. You have power. You could have just stayed away. You could have ignored me. Why come here and burn it all down?" Sarah looked down at him. She didn't feel the glee she thought she might. She didn't feel joy. She felt a cold, hard sense of balance, like an equation finally resolving to zero. "Because you didn't just break my heart, Richard," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 5 years of silence. "You tried to break my reality. You gaslit me. You told me I was the anchor dragging you down. You told me I was useless, that my contributions were imaginary, that I was nothing without you." She took a slow step closer, her shadow falling over him. "You invited me here today, not to celebrate your happiness, but to confirm my misery," she continued. "You wanted to see me broken, so you could feel whole. I couldn't let that stand, Richard. I had to show you that the woman you threw away was the only reason you were standing at the top in the first place. Richard lowered his head, a sob racking his body. I have nothing, he whispered. You took everything. I took back what was mine, Sarah corrected. The money, the company, the credit. I built it. You just spent it. She reached into a small, crystal-encrusted clutch. Richard flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon or another lawsuit. Instead, she pulled out a single, rusted iron key. It was old, jagged, and stained with grease. An object that looked completely out of place against her manicured nails and diamond jewelry. She tossed it. It hit the stone paver in front of Richard with a metallic clink that sounded louder than the ocean. Richard stared at it. He recognized it instantly. It was a relic from a lifetime ago. What is this? He whispered, dread coiling in his stomach. The key to the detached garage, Sarah said, her tone devoid of malice, purely practical. The one behind the guest house. I own the estate now, Richard. The locks on the main mansion have already been changed. Arthur saw to that 10 minutes ago. She adjusted her shawl, the diamonds around her neck catching the fading sunlight. But I'm not a monster. I know you have nowhere to go. Your credit cards are frozen. Your friends have abandoned you. Tiffany has taken the only car you didn't lease. So, I'm offering you a roof. Richard stared at the key. Flashbacks assaulted him. The garage, the smell of oil and stale coffee, the nights 10 years ago, when they were just two kids with a laptop and a dream. Sarah had written the code there, wrapped in blankets because they couldn't afford a heater, while he paced back and forth, talking about the future. You're leaving me in the garage, he choked out. Like a dog? It's where we started, Richard, Sarah said, turning away, her profile sharp and beautiful against the sky. It's where I built the foundation you stood on. I think it's poetic that you end up there. Maybe, in the cold and the quiet, you'll remember who actually did the work, she signaled to Arthur. We're done here. Yes, Miss Sterling. Sarah began to walk back down the aisle. Her movement was fluid, regal. She didn't stomp like Tiffany. She glided. Her crimson train flowed over the white petals, a river of blood conquering a field of surrender. She didn't look back. Not once. She didn't look at the sobbing man in the dirt. She didn't look at the ruined wedding cake melting in the sun. She simply walked toward her future. The chauffeur stood by the Rolls-Royce Phantom, holding the door open. As Sarah slid into the plush leather interior, the first drop of rain fell. Then another. Then a deluge. The sky, having held back its judgment all day, finally opened up. As the massive engine of the Rolls-Royce roared to life, purring with the confidence of unchecked power, the rain began to wash away the scene. It soaked the silk ribbons. It dissolved the expensive makeup on the discarded veil. And it soaked Richard Sterling. He sat alone on the great lawn, the water plastering his expensive suit to his skin, shivering violently. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the rusted key. It was cold against his palm. He looked at the garage in the distance, a dark, small shack at the edge of the property. It was all he had left. As the taillights of Sarah's limousine faded into the mist, Richard curled around the key and let out a scream that was swallowed instantly by the thunder. He had invited his past to his wedding to bury it, but instead he had been buried by it. The drama was over. The lesson had been taught. So, Richard Sterling learned the hardest and most expensive lesson of his life. Never underestimate the person you stepped on to get to the top, because they might just be the one holding the blueprints to your destruction. He wanted to use Sarah as a prop in his theater of success, but he forgot that she was the one who built the stage. In the end, Sarah didn't just get revenge, she redefined justice. She proved that the best retaliation isn't screaming or fighting. It's simply outgrowing your oppressor until they are nothing but a speck in your rearview mirror. Did this story satisfy your craving for absolute, high-stakes karma? If you enjoyed watching Richard get exactly what he deserved, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells us you want more stories like this. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who needs a reminder of their own worth, and subscribe with the notification bell on so you never miss our next real-life drama. What would you have done if you were Sarah? Would you have given him the garage key or left him on the street? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.